Over half of healthcare workers who report patient safety concerns face ruin. This is what it looks like when the system finishes with you. A critical care nurse who trusted the hospital that employed her collapses at the iron gates of a private estate. She has lost her license, her home, every dollar she had, all for telling the truth. Her name is Lena Vance, a veteran ER nurse with 17 years of service. Tonight, she has nothing left, but she is fighting back. The question is, who precisely did this to her? And the reclusive billionaire now standing over her broken body is about to find out. 8 months before her collapse, Lena Vance was not a victim. She was a pillar, the night shift charge nurse in the Metropolitan General Emergency Room, the one even the doctors listened to when the codes turned chaotic. She lived in a modest apartment filled with plants and the fatigue of 2 decades in healthcare. Her life was rhythms, the 12-hour shift, the quiet drive home at dawn, the saved money for a house she kept thinking she'd buy next year. She was good at her job, and that job was her identity, until she saw the numbers that didn't add up. It started with the sepsis bundles, a treatment protocol for the sickest patients, where every minute counts. Lena noticed the hospital was reporting near-perfect compliance rates to Medicare, 98%, which would trigger massive bonus payments. But on the floor, she was watching nurses cut corners to meet the impossible time targets. Medications delayed, blood cultures drawn late, charts being retroactively corrected. She brought it to her supervisor, a weary man named Carl. Lena, it's pressure from upstairs, the metrics. Just make sure your team documents it right. Document it right, not do it right. That was the first crack. The second crack was the patient in bed 4, Mr. Henderson, a 72-year-old with pneumonia. His insurance was a lucrative private plan. Lena watched his chart inflate with procedures he didn't receive, consults that never happened, a phantom echocardiogram, an unnecessary respiratory therapy session. When she flagged it for the billing department, she was told it was a coding error. But then she saw the same pattern with another patient, and another. It wasn't an error, it was a system. Here, what most people don't understand about hospital fraud. It's rarely one villain stealing cash from a safe. It's a slow, bureaucratic seepage, upcoding a diagnosis to get a higher reimbursement, performing unnecessary tests to maximize billing, and most insidiously, falsifying quality metrics to cheat pay-for-performance programs. Medicare fraud alone costs taxpayers over $100 billion a year. At Metropolitan General, Lena was starting to see the machinery of that number at work. Her conscience had a partner, Mark, a younger nurse on her shift with a bad habit of idealism. They began keeping a separate log, a shadow record of the discrepancies they saw between what was done for patients and what was billed to insurers and the government. It started as a way to cover themselves. It became evidence. The weight of it changed her. The plants in her apartment began to die from neglect. The breaking point had a name, Jamie Cole, a 19-year-old diabetic who came in with ketoacidosis. The sepsis protocol was initiated, but in the rush to hit the arbitrary time metrics for the bonus, a critical antibiotic was administered before the required blood cultures were drawn, contaminating the results and delaying the proper treatment. Jamie coded. They got him back, but with neurological damage. The official chart, however, was pristine, perfect compliance, a bonus secured. A life altered forever. Lena sat in her car after that shift and didn't start the engine for 40 minutes. She went up the chain, past Carl to the director of nursing, Elena Shaw. Shaw listened with a face of polished stone. Lena, you're exhausted. The Cole case was tragic, but protocol was followed. Our legal and compliance teams audit these things. But Lena had the shadow log. She mentioned it. Shaw's expression didn't change, but her eyes did. Bring me that log. Let's review it together properly. It was a test. Lena, trusting the system one last time, agreed. The retaliation did not start with a scream. It started with a whisper. The next week, Lena was pulled from charge nurse duties. Temporary, they said, to reduce your stress. Then came the mandatory performance improvement plan, citing vague issues with team communication and administrative follow-through. Her shifts were changed erratically. She was isolated. Mark was suddenly transferred to a different unit. When she asked why, she was told it was for his development. The message was clear: stand down. But Lena Vance had spent 17 years standing up, for patients crashing, for families crumbling, for new nurses drowning. This was no different. She contacted a lawyer who specialized in the False Claims Act, the federal law that allows whistleblowers to sue on behalf of the government. What she learned was a double-edged sword. If she proceeded, the case would be sealed, investigated in secret. She could be entitled to a percentage of any money recovered. But first, she would have to walk through fire. Her lawyer was blunt. They will try to destroy you. They will attack your credibility, your mental health, your every professional mistake. Are you prepared to lose your job? Lena filed the sealed, qui tam lawsuit 6 months before the night at the gates. For 60 days, nothing happened. Then, someone leaked. She doesn't know who, but the hospital's lawyers received a tip, and the full, calculated force of the institution turned on one nurse. She was placed on immediate, unpaid administrative leave for an internal investigation into possible misconduct. Her access to the hospital was revoked. Her email was frozen. Then, the state nursing board received an anonymous complaint alleging medication errors and negligence. Her license was suspended pending investigation. Without a license, she couldn't work anywhere. The final blow was financial. The legal fees were mounting. She burned through her savings in 2 months. Then came the eviction notice. The man who opened his gate that rainy night was Kalen Reed, a former special operations medic who built a billion-dollar private security empire and then vanished from public view. He lived behind walls not just to keep people out, but to keep a painful past in. He carried her inside, called his personal physician, and saw past the wet scrubs to the utter dissolution of a person. He asked one question: who are you running from? As Lena slept under sedation in a guest room, Reed did what he does best. He began to investigate. He started with the public records, the license suspension, the vague news item about a personnel matter at Metropolitan General. But the digital footprint was too clean. The hospital's story was airtight. A troubled nurse, performance issues, standard oversight. It was the silence that screamed. So Reed dug deeper into a place few can reach, the hidden financial architecture. And what he found in the hospital's procurement records wasn't just fraud. It was a blueprint for revenge. Reed traced a single-line item, a shipment of cardiac defibrillator pads billed to the hospital at $1,200 per unit. The manufacturer's code led to a shell company registered in Delaware. That shell company's bank records, which Reed accessed through methods he didn't explain, showed a single beneficiary, a private equity firm called Axiom Health Partners. Axiom, he discovered, was the majority owner of Metropolitan General Hospital. They weren't just committing fraud. They were stealing from themselves, from the hospital's operating budget, to inflate losses, then using those losses to justify cutting nurse staffing, closing wards, and denying equipment requests. The very shortages that were killing patients were being engineered for profit, and Lena's whistleblowing threatened to expose the entire scheme. While Lena slept for 18 hours, Reed assembled a dossier. He saw the pattern. The phantom billing she'd caught was just the visible weed. The root system was the predatory financialization of the hospital itself. Axiom had loaded the hospital with debt in the acquisition, then siphoned millions through these inflated supply contracts. The goal wasn't to heal patients. It was to harvest the institution until it was a hollow shell, and anyone who threatened the cash flow had to be eliminated. Lena was not a nuisance. She was a strategic target. When she woke, confused in a room that smelled of linen and money, Reed was waiting with food and a file. "You were right about everything," he said, "but you were looking at the symptom. This is the disease." He showed her the connections, the flow of money. Lena, who understood blood flow and pathophysiology, saw the corporate thrombosis immediately. "They're bleeding the hospital dry," she whispered, her voice raw. "Yes, and they made you the cause of the patient's death, not the blocked artery." Reed offered her a choice. She could stay hidden. He could arrange a new identity, a quiet life far away, or she could fight. But to fight, they had to do more than prove fraud. They had to prove conspiracy and intentional retaliation. They needed the one thing the hospital's lawyers had successfully buried, the whistleblower log she and Mark had kept. Lena had hidden a physical copy. It was in a storage locker, paid for with the last of her cash, under a false name. Getting it was their first mission. It was also their first mistake. Reed drove her in an unmarked car. The locker facility was on the city's edge. As Lena approached the unit, a black sedan with tinted windows pulled into the lot. It didn't park, it idled. Reed, watching from the driver's seat, felt the old operational chill. He texted her one word: abort. But Lena was already turning the key. She grabbed the metal lockbox inside and turned to leave. the sedan's engine revved. What happened next unfolded in 7 seconds. Reed pulled his car between Lena and the sedan, blocking its path. He stepped out, not aggressively, but with a posture that communicated a world of consequence. The sedan's window rolled down halfway. The man inside wore a suit. He wasn't police. Private security, Reed assessed. The man said that property is evidence in an ongoing internal investigation. Reed replied, his voice flat, "You have no jurisdiction here. Leave." A silent standoff. Then the sedan reversed and sped away. They had been followed. The hospital wasn't just defending, it was hunting. Back at the estate, with the lockbox open on a walnut table, the true scale of Lena's evidence became clear. It wasn't just notes. It was dated, timed records of specific incidents, patient IDs, medication logs, and the corresponding fraudulent billing codes. It was a roadmap, but Reed pointed to a new, terrifying entry. In the weeks before she was suspended, Lena had noted a series of meetings between the hospital's chief financial officer, a man named David Armitage, and a representative from the state health department. They were friendly, Lena recalled, laughing in the hallway. Reed's research confirmed the worst. That state health department official was the brother-in-law of the chairman of the state nursing board, the board that had suspended her license. The retaliation was not just corporate. It was a closed loop. Reed's next move was to go on the offensive quietly. He used his network to find Mark, the transferred nurse. He was living in a different city, working at a clinic, and he was terrified. When Reed's contact reached him, Mark initially denied everything. Then when he learned Lena was safe, he broke down on the phone. He told them that after his transfer, 2 men from hospital risk management had visited him. They showed him photos of his children's school. They suggested that if he ever spoke about his time at Metropolitan General, his nursing career would end and his family would face unforeseen hardships. He'd signed a non-disclosure agreement for a small severance. He was a silenced witness. Lena's legal case, they realized, was frozen in the sealed Quitam system, likely being slow-walked by a sympathetic judge or buried under a mountain of procedural motions. The hospital's strategy was to wait her out, to let her starve and break before the case ever saw daylight. They had to change the battlefield. Reed proposed a dangerous gambit. They would bypass the legal bottleneck and go after the hospital's public reputation and its financial lifeline, its bond ratings and investors. To do that, they needed to leak the evidence to someone with both the reach and the immunity to use it. Reed identified 3 potential allies: a Pulitzer-winning investigative journalist named Anya Petrova, who had taken down a pharmaceutical giant, a former federal prosecutor now running for state attorney general, and a hedge fund manager known for short-selling corrupt companies. Each was a high-risk, high-reward play. They chose Petrova, reasoning that sunlight was the best disinfectant and public outrage could force government action. Contacting her required a secure, anonymized channel. Reed arranged a dead drop, an encrypted file delivered to a post office box known to be used by her research assistant. The file contained a fraction of the evidence, enough to prove the pattern, but not enough to reveal all their sources. The cover note from Reed read, "The attached is verifiable. The source is a former employee whose life has been destroyed for speaking up. She is ready to talk, with guarantees of safety." They waited. For 3 days, nothing. Then, on the 4th morning, Lena's suspended phone, which Reed had kept in a signal-blocking pouch, lit up with a notification. It was a Google alert for her own name. Anya Petrova had just published a bombshell investigation on a major news site. The headline, "The Cost of Care, How a Major Hospital Profit Optimization Strategy Put Patients at Risk." The article detailed the fraudulent billing schemes, the sepsis protocol manipulations, and included anonymized excerpts from internal nursing logs. It named David Armitage, the CFO. It mentioned Axiom Health Partners, but critically, it did not name Lena. Petrova had honored their condition. The effect was instantaneous. Metropolitan General's stock price, which was publicly traded through a parent corporation, dropped 8% in pre-market trading. The hospital issued a furious denial, calling the article a malicious fabrication by disgruntled former employees. They announced an independent review by a firm they themselves had hired. It was a classic deflection, but the genie was out of the bottle. Then the counterattack began, not with a lawsuit but with a smear. A fringe website known for political hit pieces published a story about a mentally unstable nurse with a history of medication errors who was obsessed with bringing down her former employer. It named Lena. It included her photo, her address, her old address. It fabricated details about a prior hospitalization for depression. The article was picked up by a few louder outlets, creating a fog of doubt. This was the playbook: destroy the whistleblower's credibility, make the story about her, not the evidence. Lena saw the article on Reed's secured computer. She read the lies about her mental state, the mocking tone. She stood up, walked to the bathroom, and was violently sick. When she came out, her face was pale, but her eyes were burning. "They're trying to make me look crazy," she said. "They're trying to make you sound crazy," Reed corrected. "There's a difference. We need to make you sound like the only sane person in the room." His plan escalated. They would use the smear to their advantage. He contacted the former federal prosecutor running for attorney general, a woman named Elena Vargas. Vargas was trailing in the polls, needing a big, righteous cause. Reed's offer was simple: provide Lena with sworn testimony and full evidence, on the record, in exchange for a public promise from Vargas to open a criminal investigation into the hospital and the nursing board if elected. It was a political Hail Mary. Vargas, after verifying the evidence with her own team, agreed. A secret meeting was arranged at a neutral law office. Lena, protected by Reed and a former colleague from his security team, gave a 4-hour deposition. She walked Vargas through every line of the log, every patient case, every suspicious meeting. It was the first time she had told the whole story out loud to someone in power who actually listened. When she finished, Vargas was quiet. Then she said, "They tried to erase you. We're going to make you unforgettable." 2 days later, at a press conference, candidate Elena Vargas stood before reporters and did the unthinkable. She named Lena Vance. She described her as a hero. She outlined the allegations of fraud and retaliation in precise detail, and she pledged that, if elected, her first act would be a grand jury investigation into Metropolitan General Hospital, Axiom Health Partners, and the State Nursing Board for conspiracy to obstruct justice. The story exploded from the business section to the front page. Lena was no longer an anonymous leaker. She was the public face of a scandal. The hospital's response was swift and brutal. Within hours, they filed a massive defamation lawsuit against Lena Vance and John Does 1 through 10, aiming to discover Reed's involvement. The lawsuit claimed $50 million in damages. They also filed an emergency motion with the court overseeing the sealed Qui Tam case, accusing Lena of violating the seal by leaking information to the press, and demanding her case be thrown out and that she be ordered to pay the hospital's legal fees. It was a pincer movement: bankrupt her with one suit, destroy her legal shield with the other. Lena was now exposed in the brightest possible light, and the predators were circling. Reed's estate, which had been a sanctuary, was identified. News vans camped at the end of the driveway. Drone cameras buzzed over the walls. Then, a certified letter arrived from the city zoning board, citing complaints about unauthorized use of a residential property for commercial security operations. It was a warning shot. They knew who he was, and they could make his life difficult too. The pressure was immense, but it also created a fracture. Inside the hospital, whispers became conversations. An anonymous email arrived in Petrova's public inbox from an address that self-destructed after reading. It contained a single sentence: "The cardiac catheterization lab. Look at the equipment lease agreements from Q3 last year." Reed followed the thread. He found that the hospital was leasing a multi-million-dollar imaging machine from a company that didn't exist. The payments were going to another Axiom-linked shell company. It was pure embezzlement, and it was happening in the department that treated the most critical heart patients. This was their golden ticket, a crime so blatant, so divorced from any patient care excuse that it could not be explained away. But as Reed compiled this new evidence, his systems alerted him to a sophisticated cyber intrusion attempt. It was traced to a server cluster in Eastern Europe, but the fingerprints were familiar, the same digital signature he'd seen probing the hospital's own records weeks earlier. The hospital hadn't hired amateur private eyes. They had contracted with a private cyber mercenary firm. The battle was no longer just legal or public relations. It was digital, and it was global. Reed looked at Lena, who was staring at the lawsuit papers, her hands steady for the first time in weeks. They're escalating because they're scared, he said. Lena nodded. Good. Then she asked the question that would change everything. How do we not just defend, but attack? Where are they vulnerable right now? Reed smiled, a cold, tactical expression. They're vulnerable in the one place they think is impregnable, the money, and I know exactly how to make it bleed. Reed's target wasn't the hospital. It was Axiom Health Partners' next deal. Through his financial intelligence network, he learned Axiom was days away from closing a massive $500 million acquisition of a chain of rural hospitals. The deal relied on bond financing and investor confidence that was already shaky after Petrova's article. Reed's plan was to trigger a covenant breach, a technical default, on the hospital's existing debt by proving deliberate fraud to the bondholders. If the bonds were called, the entire Axiom empire would tremble. He packaged the evidence of the phantom catheter lab lease, the defibrillator pad scheme, and the manipulated sepsis data into a forensic financial report. He didn't send it to the press. He sent it, anonymously, to the credit rating agencies and the institutional investors holding Metropolitan General's bonds. The reaction was a silent earthquake. Within 48 hours, the bond rating for Metropolitan General's debt was placed on watch for downgrade. The yield on its bonds spiked, meaning it cost more for them to borrow money. The stock price of Axiom's parent company slid another 12%. More importantly, the acquisition of the rural hospital chain was put on indefinite hold. For the first time, Lena's fight was costing the other side real money. Axiom didn't fold. It fought back with a weapon they hadn't anticipated: regulatory capture. The state health department, prompted by the hospital's powerful lobbyists, announced a surprise comprehensive audit of Metropolitan General, not for fraud, but for patient safety and licensure compliance. It was a Trojan horse. The audit team would have full access, and Lena knew exactly what they would find: a hospital hollowed out by Axiom's cuts, with overworked staff and depleted supplies. The narrative would flip. The hospital would become the victim of unfounded attacks that harmed patient care by distracting leadership. They would use the very damage they caused as a shield. Lena watched this unfold in despair. They're going to blame the consequences on me, she said. The shortages, the low morale, they'll say it's because of the scandal I created. Reed agreed. It's a classic inversion. We need to get ahead of it. We need a witness from inside the current staff. Someone still on the floor who sees what's happening. Finding that person was nearly impossible. The culture of fear was absolute. Then, Lena remembered someone, Chloe, a nurse practitioner in the oncology unit, who had once quietly thanked her for trying to fix things. Lena had no way to contact her. Reed devised a risky face-to-face approach. He would arrange for Lena to be seen, publicly and safely, in a place where a staff member might approach her. He chose a downtown cafe at a busy lunch hour, with his security team blending into the crowd. Lena sat at a table visible in the window. She felt exposed, a rabbit in a clearing. For an hour, nothing. Then a woman in scrubs carrying a takeout bag stopped dead on the sidewalk. It was Chloe. Her eyes widened. She looked around, terrified, then hurried inside. She didn't go to the counter. She walked straight to Lena's table, placed a folded napkin next to her coffee, and whispered, "Check the staff scheduling portal. The ghost shifts." Then she was gone. Back at the estate, they deciphered the note. Reed hacked into the hospital's external staff portal, a surprisingly weak system. What he found in the scheduling software was a new level of deceit: ghost shifts. The administration was scheduling and paying for full nursing shifts that didn't exist, padding the staffing numbers sent to the state regulators to avoid fines for being understaffed. The money for these fake shifts was being drawn from the same budget line as the fraudulent equipment leases. It was a perfect circle: steal money for fake equipment, use some of that money to pay for fake staff, and report perfect compliance to the law. The patient care floor was a ghost town, but on paper, it was fully manned. This was the "it gets worse" moment. The fraud wasn't just about stealing. It was about constructing an entire fictional reality for regulators and investors. A Potemkin hospital, and the audit team walking in would be shown this fictional reality backed by falsified digital records. Armed with this, Reed and Lena made a desperate call to Elena Vargas, the Attorney General candidate. They needed her to act now, before the state audit whitewashed everything. Vargas was cautious. Going after the state health department was political suicide. But then Reed played his ace. He had traced the ghost shift payments. They weren't just disappearing. A portion was being funneled through several layers of consulting fees to a political action committee that had donated heavily to the current Attorney General, Vargas's opponent, and to the chairman of the State Health Committee. The corruption wasn't just corporate. It had purchased the regulators. Vargas was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Send me everything, every single document. I'm not waiting for the election." What happened next was a legal and political detonation. Vargas held an emergency press conference, not as a candidate, but as a former federal prosecutor with evidence of a crime. She presented the flowchart of money, from hospital budget to fake equipment leases to fake nurse salaries to political PACs. She didn't mince words. She accused the hospital, Axiom, and unnamed public officials of racketeering and conspiracy to defraud the public. She called for a federal investigation and for the state audit to be halted immediately as it was compromised. The story was now a supernova. It had everything: healthcare, politics, money. Federal agencies, previously quiet, began making inquiries. The hospital's lawsuit against Lena suddenly looked like a blatant intimidation tactic. Reporters descended on the nursing board, demanding answers about the chairman's connections. In the eye of this hurricane, Lena received a message, not an email or a letter. A handwritten note slipped under the door of Reed's estate gatehouse. It read, "The boy who lived, Jamie Cole, ask about his medication pump." It was signed with a single letter, M. Mark. Reed's blood ran cold. He knew immediately. They had threatened Mark's children before. This was a signal of unimaginable courage. Lena explained, Jamie Cole was the teenage diabetic who'd been brain damaged after the sepsis protocol failure. He was discharged to a long-term care facility, reliant on a sophisticated insulin pump. Reed dug. He found that the model of pump Jamie used was part of a bulk purchase contract from a supplier called Med Solutions. That supplier was another Axiom shell company, and that specific pump model had been the subject of a quiet, internal hazard alert 6 months before Jamie's admission, an alert that had never been disseminated to the nursing staff at Metropolitan General. The hospital had knowingly purchased and used potentially faulty equipment on a vulnerable patient, then covered up the known risk. Jamie's tragedy wasn't just a medical error born of rushed metrics. It was a direct, foreseeable result of the profit-driven supply chain fraud. This moved the case from financial corruption to something darker: depraved indifference. They had their smoking gun, but as they prepared to take this to Vargas and the now involved federal investigators, the cyber warfare escalated violently. Reed's entire estate network was hit with a coordinated military-grade attack. It wasn't just probing, it was a full assault designed to cripple, destroy data, and expose their location. His systems fought back autonomously, but he recognized the attack patterns. This wasn't a private cyber mercenary firm anymore. This was a state-level actor. Axiom hadn't just hired hackers. They had hired a digital private army, the kind used by intelligence agencies. As firewalls blared, Reed made a decision. He couldn't protect Lena here anymore. The estate was a target. He moved them to a secondary, off-grid location, a safe house he maintained with no digital footprint. As they drove away in the middle of the night, Lena looked back at the glowing estate. "I brought this to your door," she said, her voice hollow. "No," Reed replied, his eyes on the dark road. "They did, and now they've shown us exactly how scared they are. They're not trying to win a lawsuit anymore, they're trying to erase us." In the sterile quiet of the safe house, the dynamic shifted. Lena was no longer a protected victim. She was a co-commander in a war. She studied the Jamie Cole evidence with a forensic intensity Reed recognized from the best analysts he'd worked with. She connected the pump hazard alert to specific purchase orders, to specific Axiom board meeting minutes where cost-cutting was praised. She built the timeline that proved knowledge and intent. Meanwhile, the public world was collapsing for Axiom. The Federal Securities and Exchange Commission opened an investigation into stock manipulation. Major investors filed class action lawsuits. The bond rating was downgraded to junk status. The CEO of Axiom Health Partners resigned to pursue other opportunities. It was a sacrifice of the king to save the kingdom. But Lena knew the kingdom itself had to fall. Metropolitan General was still operating, still dangerous. The state audit was still proceeding, though now under intense scrutiny. They needed to deliver the final, incontrovertible blow, and Lena realized they had one final, untapped source of truth: the patients, the people whose bodies bore the cost of the fraud. With Reed's logistical help, and through Vargas's emerging political leverage, they filed a motion to unseal her qui tam whistleblower lawsuit immediately, citing the imminent threat to public safety. The judge, feeling the heat of national media, agreed. For the first time, Lena Vance's full, official complaint, with names, dates, and the evidence of the Jamie Cole cover-up, became a public court document. The day it was unsealed, Lena Vance did the bravest thing of her life. She walked out of the safe house, put on a simple blazer, and stood before a forest of cameras at a press conference with Elena Vargas. No disguise, no anonymity. She held up a photo of Jamie Cole before his admission, a smiling teenager. Her voice never shook as she said, "This is what their prophets looked like. They knew the equipment was faulty. They knew the protocols were broken. They did it anyway. And then they tried to silence anyone who cared. I am here to say that did not work." It was the perfect, human climax to the complex financial scandal. The image of the nurse and the photo of the broken boy dominated the news cycle. Public pressure became an avalanche. The next morning, the board of directors of Metropolitan General Hospital announced the immediate termination of CEO Elena Shaw and CFO David Armitage. They disavowed the lawsuit against Lena, calling it a regrettable error. They announced full cooperation with all investigations. It was a surrender. Lena and Reed watched the announcement on a small monitor in the safe house. There was no celebration. The cost had been too high. Lena's career was still in ruins. Her license was still suspended. Jamie Cole was still brain damaged. The hospital was still standing, just under new management. Reed looked at her. "It's not over," he said. "The people who did this to you, they'll get golden parachutes. They'll move to other companies. The system protects them." Lena nodded slowly, staring at the screen where talking heads were already debating the broader implications for healthcare. Then she turned to him, and for the first time since that night at the gate, she looked not broken and not just determined, but strategically calm. "I know," she said, "so we don't stop at them. We use the victory to change the system that built them." She was no longer fighting for restitution. She was planning a revolution. The surrender of the hospital board was not the end. It was the beginning of a reckoning that would take 2 long years to unfold. The first domino to fall was Lena's license. The state nursing board, now under the glare of a federal investigation and public outrage, hastily convened a review. They reinstated her credentials with a full apology, expunging the suspension from her record. It was a bureaucratic formality, but for Lena, it was the return of her identity. She was a nurse again. The sealed qui tam whistleblower lawsuit, now unsealed and turbocharged by the evidence Reed had uncovered, moved with unexpected speed. The federal government formally intervened, taking over the case from Lena's private attorney. This was the moment of maximum leverage. The Department of Justice presented Metropolitan General and Axiom Health Partners with a choice: face a public trial with evidence of fraud stretching back years, or settle. The hospital, bleeding investors, and on the verge of losing its Medicare funding, chose to settle. The numbers were staggering. Metropolitan General and Axiom agreed to a global settlement of $187 million to resolve the False Claims Act allegations. It was one of the largest hospital fraud settlements in a decade. Of that amount, Lena Vance, as the whistleblower, was entitled by law to a percentage. Her share was $28 million. The money was life-changing, but it felt like blood money. She looked at the check, a number with more zeros than she'd ever seen, and thought of Jamie Cole's face. The justice system turned next to the individuals. David Armitage, the former CFO, was indicted on 12 counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Elena Shaw, the former director of nursing, cut a deal for her cooperation. She testified about the pressure from Axiom to meet financial targets at all costs, revealing the systemic nature of the scheme. She received 3 years of probation and a permanent ban from healthcare administration. The The chairman of the State Nursing Board resigned in disgrace. The web of corruption was being dismantled thread by thread. But Lena's focus, as she told Reed, was on the system, not just the people. With her settlement money, she established the Vance Foundation. Its mission was twofold: to provide legal and financial support to other healthcare whistleblowers and to fund independent audits of hospital staffing and supply contracts. Reed matched her contribution anonymously, doubling the foundation's war chest. He also joined its board, applying his intelligence-gathering skills to forensic accounting for the public good. Lena's public advocacy became her new career. She testified before Congress on the need for stronger whistleblower protections in healthcare. She worked with Elena Vargas, who won the election for Attorney General in a landslide, to draft the Jamie Cole Act, state legislation that would criminalize the knowing falsification of hospital staffing records and create a protected channel for reporting supply chain fraud. The bill faced fierce opposition from hospital lobbyists, but the public momentum was undeniable. Reed, meanwhile, underwent his own transformation. The reclusive billionaire became a visible, if uncomfortable, public figure. He used his security expertise not to hide, but to protect, offering pro bono cybersecurity to other whistleblowers and journalists. His estate remained his home, but the gates were now open to a different kind of guest: activists, lawyers, and investigators fighting similar battles. The man who had built walls found a purpose in helping others tear them down. 1 year after the settlement, Lena received a visit from Mark, the nurse who had been silenced. He had left healthcare altogether, but with the threats gone, he had started therapy. He came to thank her. "You finished what we started," he said. It was the first time Lena allowed herself to feel something like pride. The hospital itself was a case study in forced reform. Under a federal monitoring agreement, it was required to overhaul its entire compliance department, install transparent financial tracking software, and establish a nurse-led ethics committee with real power. The ghost shifts ended. The fraudulent supply contracts were cancelled. For the first time in years, the budget for actual medical supplies increased. Patient satisfaction scores, which had been abysmal, began a slow climb. The institution was healing, but the scars remained. And then came the final, surprising detail. As part of the settlement, the Justice Department mandated that Metropolitan General fund an independent study on the clinical outcomes linked to the fraudulent sepsis protocol manipulations. The study's findings, published in a major medical journal, were devastating. It concluded that the pressure to hit time metrics for bonuses had directly contributed to poorer patient outcomes and potentially hundreds of avoidable complications. The academic validation was a quiet, profound victory. Lena's clinical instincts, once dismissed as the complaints of a troublesome nurse, were now enshrined in peer-reviewed literature. On the 2-year anniversary of the night she collapsed at his gate, Lena and Reed stood together at a Vance Foundation fundraiser. She was delivering a speech to a room full of donors and reporters. She spoke about the importance of speaking up about the cost of silence. She did not mention the millions, the prison sentences, or the corporate reforms. She talked about the feeling of a patient's hand in yours and the sacred duty to protect it. As she spoke, she caught Reed's eye in the crowd. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Afterwards, a young nurse approached her trembling. She worked at a different hospital, but she saw the same patterns. She whispered her fears. Lena listened, then handed her a card with a secure number. "Call this tomorrow," she said. "You're not alone anymore." In that moment, the cycle of fear was broken, replaced by a chain of solidarity. Lena Vance's life was not restored to what it was. It was rebuilt into something stronger, with purpose etched into its foundation. She had her apartment back, though she bought a new one with a view of the city. She had her career back, though she no longer worked shifts in the ER. She had her dignity back, amplified. The system that tried to break her had, in the end, been forced to bend. As for Kalen Reed, he found in Lena's cause the mission his wealth and skills had always lacked. He remained a complex, private man, but the part of him that was a healer, the former medic, was no longer at war with the part that was a warrior. They had forged a partnership that was neither romance nor charity, but a deep, strategic alliance built on mutual respect and a shared understanding of how to fight battles worth winning. The documentary could end here, with justice served and a new chapter begun, But the real ending is not a point, but a direction. Lena Vance and Kaylin Reed turned their attention to the next hospital, the next whistleblower, the next hidden ledger, because they understood the most important lesson of all: the fight is never over, it just moves to a new front. And now they were ready. The story of Lena Vance forces us to ask a difficult question about the places we trust with our lives. It reveals a terrifying vulnerability in the very system designed to catch its own failures. The legal protections exist. The whistleblower laws are on the books. But as we've seen, a determined institution can weaponize bureaucracy, manipulate regulators, and deploy immense financial and psychological pressure to silence truth. It makes you wonder, how many other Lena Vances are out there right now, broken and alone, because they tried to do the right thing? This case was a victory, but it was an exception. It required a perfect storm: a whistleblower with meticulous evidence, a billionaire with unique resources, and a political moment ripe for scandal. Most who speak up do not have a Kaylin Reed. They have only their conscience, and they are crushed by the weight of the machine they challenged. The research is clear. Over half of healthcare workers who report serious concerns face retaliation. The system, as currently constructed, incentivizes silence. So what changes? It starts with scrutiny. It starts with demanding transparency in how our hospitals are funded and staffed. It starts with supporting legislation that protects, rather than punishes, those who speak up. And it starts with remembering that the most important stories are often told by the quietest voices in the room, the ones who see the cracks in the foundation before the whole structure trembles. Lena's journey from the cold pavement to the heart of a national reform movement is a blueprint for courage. It proves that even the most powerful systems can be held accountable. But it also serves as a warning. Our safety depends on the willingness of ordinary people to become extraordinary witnesses. Their voice is our early warning system. We must learn to listen. If you found this deep dive into power, corruption, and justice compelling, make sure to subscribe. We bring you the real stories behind the headlines, the human battles that define our world. Thanks for watching.